Welcome to episode 299 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. Today's episode is celebrating the best of the Brainy Business podcast in its first 5 years. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Welcome to the podcast for the 299th time. Is that amazing or what? I mean, how many things do we do 299 times? Every week and now twice a week for 5 full years. I'm sure it isn't too surprising to learn that I've been reflecting upon these milestones a lot recently. It's pretty cool that the 300th episode and 5-year mark come so close together as well, thanks to those doubled up episodes, especially because that allowed me to do a countdown celebrating the best episodes of the podcast from these first 5 years in kind of fun fashion here of celebrating 299 as we roll our way in to 300 episodes. Personally, I could never choose a favorite, let alone, ranking the best here, because truly it's like each one of these episodes is one of my babies. I love all 299 of them the same. And thankfully, I don't have to vote for or choose my favorites because you have already done that for me. How? Well, you've been casting your votes with every download of the past 5 years. And how many votes made it into the tally? Well, that's 904,605 votes from over 170 countries that were cast at the time I pulled the data here, and those downloads gave us our top episodes. Side note, can you believe we're on track to hit 1 million downloads soon? So cool. How do you think I should celebrate that milestone? Tag me on social media. You'll find me as the Brainy Biz, B-I-Z, pretty much everywhere, and as Melina Palmer on LinkedIn. And come let me know how you think we should celebrate that massive 1,000,000-point milestone when it comes. And while you are welcome to take notes as the episode goes along to account for all the episodes you want to go back and listen to in case you missed any on the list or just want to hear them again, do know that I've made it easy for you to access them all in the show notes for the episode, which are found within the show notes for this episode, both within the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/299. In a typical best of episode, now is the point where I would talk about the top countries and states with downloads, but I'm not going to do that today. Why? Because in 2 weeks, in our 5-year anniversary episode, data visualization designer Sarah K. Miller is here, and she has created an amazing piece of data art to commemorate those top downloads for the first 5 years. And it beautifully represents all the places where our downloads have come from. It's so gorgeous, and I can't wait to reveal it as the art for that episode 303. So I don't want to spoil anything and talk about it now. For anyone who isn't yet subscribed to the Brainy Business Podcast, now's a great time to do so to ensure you don't miss that or any other episode. And be sure to follow me, the Brainy Biz, on social media so you can see that image when it finally gets released to the world in 2 weeks. Now, without further ado, let's talk top content. I usually restrict myself to a top 10 so I don't end up talking about every episode. Like I said, they're all my babies. But for today, I do want to give the full 20. We're going to talk about the runners up in slots 11 through 20 a little bit, and then I'll give a little bit more time sharing about those top 10 episodes. So one helpful hint here, if you're taking notes for episodes you want to follow up on, the episode numbers are provided for you for a really easy reason. It's because every episode of the show has its own special shortened URL with that episode number. So when I've said that this is episode 299, you can go to thebrainybusiness.com/299 and it'll take you right there to that specific episode. So when I mention that the 20th most downloaded episode of the show was The Voltage Effect with John List, and it was episode 190, you know that you can go to thebrainybusiness.com/190 and find it super easily. So I'm not going to call them all out like that again in their own specific show notes, but it is a handy little tip in case you didn't already know that for this episode and any other time you hear me mention episode numbers, there is a reason, and it's not just for me, it's for you. Okay. So as I said there, John List got our number 20 spot when we spoke about the voltage effect, how to make good ideas great and great ideas scale. And I'm going to restrict myself to keep it short and sweet on these number 20 through 11. So we're going to move straight forward to the next one, which is number 187 on understanding motivation and implementing incentives at work with Kurt Nelson. This is fun because Kurt was just on the show a second time 2 weeks ago in episode 295. So you have two great episodes on incentives and workplace dynamics with him to choose from. So that was 187 and 295. Similarly, Troy Campbell's first episode on the science of cool, number 169, is next on the list. He has now been on the show 3 times, one of only a handful of people with that honor, and he was very recently on in episode 293, just the week before Kurt, talking about multi-narrative storytelling, which I've been getting good feedback on as well. Science of Cool was the first time that Troy was on the show. Really, really cool stuff there. So check that one out, number 169. Next, we have The Elements of Choice with Eric Johnson, which was episode 174. Anything to do with choices and decision-making is firmly rooted in the field of behavioral economics, so it's no surprise this one has resonated with so many of you. A fun conversation on a great book in The Elements of Choice. Next, we have one of 2 behavioral economics analysis episodes in the top 20 list of all time. This one is episode 73 on Starbucks. And as a note, this episode has received a recent refresh, so it's also the focus of episode 278, which is the one I'm going to link to in the show notes, since it's essentially the same episode with an updated introduction and close that I have created for you. These behavioral economics analysis episodes are very popular amongst listeners, and this one on Starbucks was a lot of fun, so I'm glad to see it in the top 20. And speaking of things that we like, coming in at number 15 of the most downloaded episodes of all time, we have number 172, Why We Like the Things We Like with Prince Guman. Prince is a co-author of the book Blind Sight, and in this episode, we talked about the balance between novelty and nostalgia and how that's important in adoption for all sorts of things. A really fun conversation on a fascinating topic, so be sure to check out episode 172. Next, we have Creating Content People Can't Help But Engage with Caitlin Burgoyne, which was episode 201 of the podcast. Caitlin is a master of engagement on social media. She has great content on Twitter and LinkedIn and a super engaging newsletter with tens of thousands of subscribers and more every day. Her tips are gold. So if you haven't yet listened to episode 201, I highly recommend it, and the Why We Buy newsletter, which she of course talks about in that episode. In a similar vein, our next most downloaded episode of all time is number 185 with the amazing Dan Gingiss, talking about how to create remarkable experiences. Dan is a co-host of the Experience This podcast, which I've been honored to have been featured on in the past. And in this episode, he talked about his book, The Experience Maker. Learn all about his WISER methodology for creating great experiences in this episode, the 13th most downloaded of all time here on the Brainy Business. Congratulations, Dan, and everyone that's on the list, of course. Next, coming in at number 12 is another solo episode and one from very, very early in the podcast, episode number 5 on the truth about pricing. Now, I am not surprised at all that this is so high on the list. It was actually the 3rd most downloaded episode for a really, really long time. But as we've been getting so many more downloads on new episodes, it's lost its, tenured spot there in the top 3 and has bumped all the way down to 12, which is exciting to really show how popular the show and episodes are getting. So I'm also not surprised because pricing is a topic I get asked about constantly, and the truth about pricing is a talk I do often. It's also the topic of one of my courses, so it makes sense that this one is a popular episode. And in case you didn't know, sneak peek alert, it's also the topic of my 3rd book, which is scheduled to come out in early 2024, so keep an eye out for that one. I can't say too much about it yet, but I'm so excited to do so when I finally get to. If you want a little taste of what's to come in that book, check out episode 5, The Truth About Pricing, which again is the 12th most downloaded episode of the podcast of these first 5 years. And if you're interested in pricing and maybe interested in sneak peeks or anything regarding this upcoming book, maybe to be on the launch team or something along those lines, send me an email to melina@thebrainybusiness.com with the subject of pricing book to get on my list and radar for that. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like yet, but joining early is a good thing. I look forward to hearing from you all. And after that, it seems fitting as we roll into the 11th most downloaded episode, which was number 177 on how to successfully pitch your business. Clearly, I've gotten pretty good at pitching over the years for people to be guests on the show, to be featured on other shows and in articles, to write for top outlets like Inc., to get a deal with a publisher for not 1, but 3 books for the clients and speaking engagements. All business, especially small business, requires a lot of pitching. So being good at it, most importantly, being comfortable with it, is hugely important. Check out episode 177 for my tips on great pitches. And yes, I do consulting and can do even just single calls to review and help improve pitches. So if that's something you're interested in, head on over to thebrainybusiness.com to book a strategy session. And you can always send me an email, melina@thebrainybusiness.com as well. Wow. Well, congratulations to those episodes and their well-deserved spots as number 11 through 20 on the most downloaded episodes ever on the Brainy Business podcast. Such a fun variation of topics from so many different years of being released on the show, everything from episode 5 to things in the 200s. I really like when that happens because it shows how the content truly is evergreen and people continue to download and get value even years after an episode came out, which is super awesome. And on that note, let's move on to our top 10. If you have ever taken or considered creating an online course, you must listen to episode 193, How to Make Online Courses People Enjoy with Chris Rollinson of 42 Courses. Chris has another awesome newsletter, which I highly recommend. It gives out lots of fun facts along with their insights from all the great courses they provide at 42 Courses. Did you know that the average online course has a 10% completion rate? Most courses aren't made with completion rates or human behavior in mind, but 42 Courses is different, and their completion rates are over 80%. Compared to 10% in the industry, it's really amazing. In this episode, Chris shared some of his tips and insights, including the gem that learning should be a fun, interactive journey of discovery. I, of course, couldn't agree more and was so delighted to actually meet Chris in person a couple months ago when I went over to London for a couple weeks, part of that Tripp was finishing up that book, The Truth About Pricing, and I had a really great time. Chris organized an event with a bunch of people that got together. I got to meet Richard Chataway and Jez Groom and Dan Bennett, just so many amazing people. So thank you to Chris, and thank you for making learning fun and nudging people to keep going. And that's potentially why his episode is the 10th most downloaded of all time in these first 5 years of the podcast. If you haven't listened yet, definitely check out episode 193 with Chris Rollinson on making online courses people enjoy and complete. Oh, and yes, you'll learn why 42. Next, coming in at number 9 is another of our behavioral economics analysis episodes. This one is number 159 on Amazon. Whether you love them or hate them, you definitely know Amazon and that they've changed the face of retail. What are they doing to incorporate behavioral economics concepts into their model? What could your business benefit from implementing? And what should you steer clear of? Learn all that and more when you tune in to episode 159 and my behavioral economics analysis of Amazon. Now, moving on to the 8th most downloaded episode of all time. It's 197, You Have More Influence Than You Think, with Vanessa Bonds. The episodes on influence have been a big hit amongst the listeners of the show. They've really resonated, as you're going to be able to tell while we go through the rest of the top 10. Vanessa's book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, is such an interesting read, full of research and insights into how people behave. Her work, and that of others showcased in the book, looks at how we may think everyone is looking at us when we have a stain on our shirt or are wearing something weird. But when everything is normal, we don't think people notice us at all. It turns out people don't really notice us as much as we think, but they also notice us much more than we think. Understanding this balance is so helpful in life and work. We talked quite a bit in the episode about how the audience will influence a speaker on a stage and what to do to have more influence in virtual meetings, including tips for the introverts out there. It is a great book and a really fun episode, so no surprise that it made it to number 8 on our top downloaded episodes of the podcast. And speaking of influence, did you know that it's a superpower? Yale professor Zoe Chance was on an episode 189 sharing about her fantastic book, Influence is Your Superpower. And that episode is the 7th most downloaded of all time here on the show. I absolutely love Zoe, and I love this book. She teaches the most popular course at the Yale School of Management, which became the basis for this internationally best-selling book, Influence is Your Superpower, which we discussed on the episode. 2 standouts for me in this book are the power of saying no and Zoe's 24 hours of no challenge. And the second thing is her magic question of what would it take and how to use that in life and business. So powerful, so fantastic. And interestingly enough, this episode is getting its refresh very soon in just a few weeks, leading into my interview with Vanessa Patrick and her book on the power of saying no, which just came out on June 1st. It very much ties in with Zoe's work and a lot of what we talked about in her episode. So definitely check out episode 189 with Zoe and know that if you miss it, it's going to be back around in episode 308 in a few weeks. And when you listen to that and you love it, you're also going to love 309 with Vanessa Patrick. All right. Next is our 6th most downloaded episode of all time and another on influence from the man who wrote the original book, Robert Cialdini, and my interview with him in episode 157, discussing the new and expanded version of influence when that came out in 2021, introducing the 7th principle of persuasion, unity. As I said, every show is special to me, and they're all my little podcast babies. And having Bob on the show and being able to chat with him has been a real high point for me in these past 5 years. While I talked a little about pitching in that episode, which was number 11 on the list, I don't actually have to pitch a lot for guests on the show. Many of them come to me from organic connections across social media or from friends or listeners recommending people that they put me in contact with. And now I get pitched from publishers and others with way more potential guests than I could keep up with. As a note, most of them don't get onto the show since it's a very curated set of guests who can speak on the topics of applying behavioral economics into business. It isn't about who has the biggest list. It's about who has the best insights for you. And I filter out a lot of stuff that I know wouldn't be a fit. So definitely know I'm doing that with your best interest in mind. Anyway, Bob is one of the first people that I pitched, and I was really anxious about it. Of course, it worked out, and I'm so glad I took that little risk. There have been others that haven't turned into interviews. I've had pitches fail. It happens to everybody, but there are now so many people who've been on the show that I never would have thought would have cared to come on. It's been really cool to see what can happen when you take the time to do the scary thing and ask. It's just like Zoe says, right? And Vanessa, and of course, Robert Cialdini. Check out this episode 157. And if you haven't already read Influence or Persuasion, do yourself a favor and snag those right now. Links in the show notes, as always. They're a must read for every business library, worth all the hundreds of pages, I promise. Now, moving on to the 5th most downloaded episode of all time. It's number 171 on the paradox of choice. While this is a solo episode with me talking about the concepts, it's definitely based on the work and book of Barry Schwartz, which has the same name. This shows how we may think we like to think that more is better, more options, more choices, more colors, more everything. But that can often lead to overwhelm and a tendency to choose nothing. When there are too many choices, people are less likely to buy, and that's a problem for your business. So check out episode 171 on the paradox of choice to learn more about that and make it easier for people to choose you. All right, that brings us to the 4th most downloaded episode of these first 5 years. We're getting close now. This was episode 198 on the Dunning-Kruger effect. Oh, yay. What a fun episode. Such a great concept. I love that this one made it into the top. A spot that isn't surprising, given that it was the 2nd most downloaded episode of the year in 2022. If you haven't heard this one yet, or even if you have, it warrants a listen. Add this episode to your list, but give it the number 266. Yes, this one has already had a replay as well because it's just so good and valuable. In case you haven't heard this one yet or just don't quite remember what it isn't the most telling name after all. Essentially, the Dunning-Kruger effect looks at the interesting relationship of confidence and competence, and how when we know very little about something, we have low competence, we have ridiculously high confidence. But once we get a little more competence and we start to see all that we don't know, confidence tanks, and it's a slow road building it back up as we learn. The terms in this one are my favorite. It talks about being on the peak of Mount Stupid at the beginning, and then you fall into the valley of despair as that competence increases enough to shatter your confidence. Think of all the high school graduates who knew everything, but then go to college and say, whoa, or again when starting a job, or learning about a new area of expertise, or all sorts of other times where we're exposed to something we think we know a lot about, and very quickly realize we know basically nothing. In this episode, I give you specific tips for things like coaching team members and knowing when they're most likely to listen to your advice instead of shrugging it off. Really important. Works with kids too. But how to be sure you don't overwhelm them so no progress gets made in that critical, fleeting moment. Of course, the Dunning-Kruger effect was featured in my 2nd book, What Your Employees Need and Can't Tell You, and it's been one of my favorite solo episodes so far, so I'm really glad that it made it to this list and being the 4th most downloaded episode of all time. All right, with that, we've now made it to the 3rd most downloaded episode of all time. It is 186, Get It Done with Ayelet Fishback. Since her episode was the top most downloaded of 2022, it probably isn't a surprise that this interview with Ayelet is in the top 3. In our conversation and the book, Get It Done, she gives tips and insights into the science of motivation to understand how you will be most likely to complete your goals and get more of the right things done. Her book talks about the value of setting the right goals and in the right way. She starts with a story of a group climbing Everest and how the relentless pursuit of goals can sometimes come at our own detriment. So it isn't about getting things done just for the sake of doing them. Summiting Everest, if you don't make it home, isn't really worth it. Instead, looking at goals in a new way and setting them up so you will complete them are the focus of this book and the episode. She's so good at phrasing things too. Ayelet was on the show a second time at the end of 2022 in a conversation with Cassie Holmes on how to have the best year by combining scientific insights from the fields of motivation and happiness. That one was episode 249 if you want to add it to your must-listen list. In that episode with Cassie, Ayelet said 2 things that really stuck with me. First, you don't want to be the one who did a thing. You want to be the one who is doing it. So smart. And keep that in mind rolling into next Friday's episode with Jonah Berger, who will be here to discuss magic words. Did I mention Jonah Berger is going to be here next week? So awesome. If you aren't yet subscribed, now's a great time to do so to be sure you don't miss that one. Anyway, the other thing Ayelet said was, a year has a very long middle when sharing that you shouldn't set year-long goals, but those on a shorter timeline to increase your chances of success. I love that. Great episode. Definitely check out 186 with Ayelet Fishback on her book, Get It Done. And with that, we find our way to the top 2 most downloaded episodes of the Brainy Business podcast in these first 5 years. True to form, episode 2 is the most downloaded episode ever. It was called The Top 5 Wording Mistakes Businesses Make, and it's all about how you can start applying behavioral economics to your communication by looking at 5 simple categories, which include being too vague, too boring, too literal, too much, and too confusing. This episode had the original mention of the cotton candy grapes and the Snickers study, 2 things I've come to be known for over the years. It's fun to have people give shout outs for these 2 things so often, especially knowing they were part of the original 3 episodes that came out when the podcast first launched on July 6th, 2018, almost 5 years ago. And speaking of that initial 3-episode bundle, our top most downloaded episode of the podcast of all time is, drumroll please, even though I kind of gave it away, episode 1, Unlocking the Secrets of the Brain. Now, in some ways, it seems strange to have the first 2 episodes be the top 2 most downloaded, right? I mean, they're the furthest ago, so it may seem like you have a long way to go back to find them. However, some of the apps tend to display episodes in number order starting with 1. Some shows need to start at 1. A lot of them do, so that makes sense. And people can often choose to sort that way regardless of what the default may be. Also, it's amazing how many people have reached out over the years to let me know that they found the podcast and started at 1 and have decided to keep going 1 at a time all the way through, even though they know they're multi-years behind. Others may pop back to episode 1 or start there, listen to the first 1 or 2, and then start jumping around to topics they're excited about from the full list. Whichever approach, episode 1 is almost always in a new listener's mix, and many move on to listen to the second one before they continue on their chosen adventure with the Brainy Business. So in that way, it makes a lot of sense. And that's a tip for all you aspiring podcasters out there. It may feel like, it's just the first episode. I'll get better as time goes on. I'll pay for editing later. I'll worry about my microphone down the way. But I get positive feedback on how good those initial episodes sound all the time. And if they would have been, not great or audio issues, people might have bailed and not kept listening. So it is worth investing in your show from the very, very beginning. I give lots of tips about podcasting through my newsletter and on social and stuff. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. So while these two have been the top two basically forever, I'm always interested to see what's going to happen as time goes on. And now that the new episodes get so many downloads, they started to blow some of the older ones out of the water, like The Truth About Pricing, which had been the third most downloaded for years. And it's been bumped all the way to 12. So who knows? As things pick up and we could be starting to get, the sky's the limit. I don't need to dwell on this, but it'll be really cool to see what happens. And this is also a big reason why we started doing these Tuesday refreshes. They are an opportunity to let new listeners know about concepts they may have missed. And even those of you who've been around for a long time, there's always something new to learn, and most people haven't heard everything. Personally, I've even found myself relearning and remembering stuff when I listen back to them to complete the refresh. And yes, if you're wondering, I still listen to and personally approve every single episode of the show. And even though I researched and wrote and recorded and have listened to them at least once in their entirety, I still learn something for what feels like new for the first time when I'm reintroduced to them. I know you will too. I purposely pick things that are at least a year old before they get a refresh. So they're going to hit you. You're going to learn new things. You grow over time as you've been listening, as you've been experiencing things in your business, and you're in a new spot now. So episodes and insights can just hit you in a new way. I always think that's really cool, and that often things are worth another listen. So if you find yourself with something that feels familiar, I always just wait it out. There's typically something that will be new, even if it's old. And with that in mind, while there are links to all the episodes in the show notes, as I've already said, at thebrainybusiness.com/299, here's a recap of the top 20 list one more time in case you're taking notes. First, we have episode 190, The Voltage Effect with John List. Next, Motivation and Incentives at Work with Kurt Nelson, which was episode 187. The Science of Cool with Troy Campbell, 169. The Elements of Choice with Eric Johnson, 174. Starbucks, a behavioral economics analysis, episode 73, or more likely you should be checking out episode 278, which is the refresh of that episode. Why We Like the Things We Like with Prince Guman, episode 172. Creating Content People Can't Help But Engage with Caitlin Burgoyne in episode 201. How to Create Remarkable Experiences with Dan Gingiss in episode 185. The Truth About Pricing in episode 5. How to Successfully Pitch Your Business in episode 177. And that brings us into our top 10, kicking it off with How to Make Online Courses People Enjoy and Complete with Chris Rollinson of 42 Courses in episode 193. A Behavioral Economics Analysis of Amazon in episode 159. You Have More Influence Than You Think with Vanessa Bonds in episode 197. Influence is Your Superpower with Zoe Chance and episode 189. Robert Cialdini and the new and expanded version of Influence featuring the 7 Principles of Persuasion in episode 157. Followed by the top 5 with The Paradox of Choice in episode 171. The Dunning-Kruger Effect, which had an original episode number of 198, but I recommend just listening to 266 since it's a refreshed version. The third most downloaded of all time, Get It Done with Ayelet Fishback in episode 186. And then we have episode 2, The Top 5 Wording Mistakes Businesses Make. And finally, episode 1, Unlocking the Secrets of the Brain. In case I haven't said it enough today, I want you to know that I appreciate you. Thank you. Wherever you're tuning in from, however many episodes you've listened to, thank you for making this first 5 years of the Brainy Business podcast amazing. I can't wait to see what the next 5 have in store. Right now, I'm excited about some new things that we've been working on behind the scenes that are getting super close to launch. I can't talk about them just yet. You know, it's killing me, but I'm going to be able to very soon. So for everyone who's already subscribed to the Brainy Business newsletter, good news, you know you're going to be hearing about all that first. For anyone who hasn't yet joined, don't worry. There are links in the show notes. And anytime you sign up for any freebie from the Brainy Business, you're automatically added. Make sure you add us to your safe list, though. It's going to be coming from melina@thebrainybusiness.com or hello@thebrainybusiness.com. And you can always email me there, melina@thebrainybusiness.com, if you have questions or want to be sure if you're on the list. You can also find me on the socials as The Brainy Biz. I try to be pretty easy to find. There are links in the show notes, of course, which are in the app you're listening to and at thebrainybusiness.com/299. Whether you want to be the first to hear about my third book, The Truth About Pricing, and maybe get a chance at a sneak peek, or to be in the know for those other exciting announcements and opportunities coming soon, your best bet is to follow me on social media. Again, The Brainy Biz, B-I-Z, pretty much everywhere, and as Melina Palmer on LinkedIn, and to subscribe to the Brainy Business newsletter. Again, links in the show notes at thebrainybusiness.com/299 for everything. I can't wait to connect with you, and thank you again for making these first 5 years of the Brainy Business podcast so amazing. Thank you for listening, subscribing, sharing, rating, and reviewing the show. Those all absolutely make a difference and help others find the show. Even after 5 years, it makes a huge difference, and it makes it easier for me to keep creating great content for you. So if you're willing, please do take a moment to do any of those things now. Subscribe, rate, review, share. It all helps. Thank you in advance. I appreciate you. And just like that, episode 299 on the best of the Brainy Business in its first 5 years is done. Join me Tuesday for another Brainy episode of the Brainy Business Podcast, number 300. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.